On today's show, we look at possibly the biggest forward in the 2024 NHL draft class. Is Dean Letourneau worth a first round pick? We'll talk about that on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hattie Kalakash, Director of North American Scouting for Dobber Prospects, with Sebastian High, Director of European Scouting and Head Scout for Dobber Prospects. And on today's show, we'll be talking about Dean Letourneau in detail. Dean Letourneau has been playing the entire year in the collegiate level at in the Canadian College League, the U18 AAA League in Canada. We'll talk about his game in detail. We'll start off with the puck skills in the first segment, the skating and the physicality. We'll get into the second segment where we talk about a bit more about the intricate stuff, the toolkit, the habits, the decision making, all that good stuff. And in our final segment, we'll talk about the projection with Dean Letourneau, which team would be the best fit and what's his upside particularly, and answer the question of whether or not he is worth a first-round pick. But before we get into that, today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Hockey GM. Ever dreamed of being an NHL GM and managing your hockey franchise? Well, now you can with Ultimate Hockey GM. It is completely free, and Locked On listeners get 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code LOCKEDONNHL in the game store. To download the game, just visit hockeygm.app or look it up on the app stores. Ultimate Hockey GM. Start your dynasty today. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you think of the episode and what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please leave us a rating review and make sure to make us your first listen of the day. So let's get things started right away with Dean Letourneau, talk with you the size, handedness, where he's been playing, the ridiculous point totals at that level, and all that good stuff to get us started here.
Yeah, for sure. So Dean Letourneau is a 6'7". That is 6'7", not a typo. 209-pound right shot centerman who played this season overwhelmingly in Canada's high school system in the U18 AAA division with St. Andrews College. He played 56 games and he scored 61 goals at 66 assists for 127 points. Those are gaudy numbers. And he played 2 individual games right at the Christmas break for the Sioux Falls Stampede in the USHL, where he did not log a point, but was playing some decent enough hockey against USHL competition, especially having been parachuted into that lineup for just a couple games in the entire season. And he is a big centerman who moves like he's 5 inches shorter than he is and has a lot of skill. There's a lot to like in this player. Everything to do with the NHL projection is a projection. Like, he is a massive project, and he will need multiple seasons to marinate. But he's off to Boston College, like, in the fall already. He moved his arrival date forward by a season. So rather than having a full season in the USHL between high school hockey and the NCAA, he's making that leap immediately, which is going to be interesting. Boston College needs size, and Dean Letourneau definitely offers size to the equation. But he also has enough skill to become an offensive producer, maybe even an offensive driver. The upside with this player is massive. We're talking top 6 unicorn type player, but there's also a potential fallback game in like a Nick Bukestad type of role where there's like bottom 6 minutes, but decent enough depth scoring and a lot of skill and flashes and potential power play upside to that. So a really intriguing profile, a very unique player in this draft class. And the puck skills are really, really good across the board, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been especially impressed with the playmaking with Dean Letourneau. We'll get into how high that carries him to the NHL level in the third segment. But to start things off here, I do want to talk about that playmaking skill. I've seen some really smart kind of give and go plays. He's really good in tight quarters. A small area playmaking is pretty good for a player of his size. You don't see that usual disconnect between hands and brain that you see with players that big. There's a big distance to the puck when you're that tall. But Dean Letourneau manages it fairly well, both in small area playmaking tools and his kind of little habits like those give and goes. But he's also capable of hitting seams, cross ice, and that kind of thing. I think, right now the main culprit is that the seams that are open stay open for way longer in the U18 AAA League versus even the USHL or especially the NCAA and NHL. But I think that he manages with what he has in front of him really, really well. It's just about how much quicker you can get his processing in order to kind of match that. But the playmaking is good in isolation. The passes are good, they're crisp, they're accurate. Smart decision making when it comes to kind of finding second or third options, even with his back to the play. I think for me, the playmaking is a standout tool. Don't rely on the 61 goals that he scored this year. That's really a result of just being big and strong. A lot of his intelligence, and effectiveness in the in that league has come through his playmaking. But talking about the shot, I think it's slightly below average, but not by far. I'd give it a 4.5 grade. The shooting's pretty decent. I mean, he's able to get shots in motion fairly well, but he's mainly a standstill shooter. And he gets a lot of those opportunities in that league. There's a lot of situations where he has 4 or 5 seconds in the slot to make his play, and he's big enough that it doesn't even matter if players try to close on him. There can be 2, 3, 4 players closing down on him. It doesn't matter. He's just way too big, way too strong, has way too big of a reach as well. I've especially liked his ability to pull pucks in tight and shoot them upstairs, which, as a big guy with that long of a reach, pulling the puck in means you're carrying it across at least a meter of ice in order to shoot it. So that makes a big difference in the location of the release. And being that big with that skill set, I think is pretty useful. The handling tools, though, I'm not as convinced. What do you think?
I like how they mesh with his speed. Like at higher speeds, the way he's able to blend his feet, his physicality, and his handling, I think is a clear strength. That's one thing where I've really liked his hands. I think when he's closer to a standstill or moving at slower paces, the handling falls apart a little bit. But when he is going at higher speeds, I do think that the hands keep up with the feet and the physicality and the brain as well. Like he is quite a creative player. He likes to implement skill into his game. And yes, like is he going to be a Tage Thompson? Almost certainly not. But I do think that there is potentially that upside if he absolutely hits and has about 7 years of development ahead of him before reaching that point. I think that's within the range of possible outcomes if it's definitely at the extreme of one of those ends. But yeah, I've liked the handling overall. I think especially for a player of his stature, I think he is a very good puck handler. How effective that's going to be overall in higher pace leagues where he has a lot less time and space to work with. Well, we're gonna see. It's gonna be a trial by fire in the NCAA next season for him, and it's going to be fascinating to track how he adapts to that and how he's able to adjust his game at that level. But I like the puck handling more than I've liked the shooting, for instance, and I think it's closer to his playmaking grade than his shooting grade. I'd give it maybe like a 5.5, but the flashes of it falling apart could be as low as like a 4. So there's also a bit of a range of inconsistency on that front with him.
Yeah, I think we can also talk about the physicality now with Letourneau because there's a decent amount to talk about. I wouldn't say he's particularly a violent player. I don't think he seeks out physical contact, but I think he knows how big and strong he is, and he's not afraid to use it. So he's a player who won't necessarily pass up an opportunity to hit a player, but won't seek it out either. He's not taking himself out of plays. He's not chasing hits. He's really kind of staying within his element. And if an opportunity to hit just shows up in front of him, he's taking it. He's trucking through the guy. Again, I think that's a product of being at that lower level of competition where players will kind of receive a puck with their head down, lots of opportunities to throw his body around. So if you watch his tape, you might think, oh, this is a big violent player. I don't think it's that. I think if you watch his decision making, his habits when it comes to hitting, he's not chasing hits. He has a lot of opportunities because a lot of players just getting with their heads down. Pretty good board mechanics, but I think he still relies a lot on his strength, and I think that's where he becomes a bit more of a project, right? Like this is a player who relies a lot on his frame, on his reach, on his strength, on his physical prowess in order to win battles, in order to protect pucks. There aren't a lot of mechanics, a lot of habits that go into his puck protection tools, into his physical tools that really complement the raw strength and reach and size that he has. So I think that's the main development objective is once he gets to the NHL, he's finally going to be facing players that are as strong as him. And that's going to be new to him. It's about how he adapts. And I think that's where he becomes more of a project than a kind of surefire thing. I do also want to talk about the skating though, because the skating is, I mean, for his size, pretty impressive. His body proportions are pretty fairly well made out, so that he doesn't have that kind of awkwardness and lankiness that those 6'7" fours usually have. I think back to like Brian Boyle, who was kind of a prime example of that, and that's why he was a perennial kind of bottom sixer, is because he kind of had that awkwardness to his stride. He kind of had heavy feet. I don't see that as much with Dean Letourneau, right?
I fully agree. He's very athletic and his motions are fluid. He's able to change his directions of momentum really like fluidly. His pivots are quite clean. He's a
Yeah.
mechanically fairly refined skater. Like if we're thinking back at previous high school players, whether they're coming from the US or from Canada, the stride mechanics for a big man are not typically as refined as they are with Dean Letourneau. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that he's like a 6th or 7th grade skater here by any means, but the fact that he is like a 5 or 5.5 grade skater, despite being a 6'7" forward out of the Canadian high school system, is very impressive. And I think that there's also runway for him to improve that grade in his college years. So I'm very curious to see how he kind of matures in that Boston College program.
I agree. But that wraps it up for our first segment. We'll get into our second segment where we talk about the toolkit, the habits, and the decision making. And I think this is a bit more where Letourneau needs some work and what makes him really a true project. We'll get into that in a sec. But just before, a quick word from our sponsors at Ultimate Hockey GM.
Hey, Locked On NHL Prospect fans. I want to take a moment to bring up one of our new partners, the mobile game Ultimate Hockey GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NHL GM and managing your hockey franchise? Do you think that you could run the Maple Leafs better than Brad Treliving? Well, your dream can come true, and this game is most definitely for you. Manage every single strategic aspect of your team, play through the seasons, and lead your team to glory. Hire the right coaches, the right scouting staff, navigate through free agency and the draft, all in a challenging and realistic game world. As a hockey fan, you know that there is no true offseason. A GM is constantly monitoring the phones, looking to make moves whenever the opportunity arises. And that's why I think that you are going to love this game. Ultimate Hockey GM is completely free, line, play on the go as you want and when you want. By the way, Locked On Network listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code LOCKEDONNHL in the game store. So make sure to check that out. To download the game, just visit hockeygm.app or look it up in the app stores. Ultimate Hockey GM. Start your dynasty today.
Alrighty, so let's move on to our second segment. We'll talk about the toolkit, the habits, and the decision making with Dean Letourneau. I want to start off with the toolkit. I think we've already mentioned a bit of it regarding the combination of skating and physicality. The combo is pretty interesting. I mean, if you look at the frame with the edge work, with the mobility, with the kind of weight transfer and crossovers, he's in a player that uses a lot of forward strides, and I think that's the main culprit with bigger guys, is they have to rely a lot on their forward strides, and their forward strides, although they're deeper, they're not as quick on their feet when they use those forward strides. With Letourneau, it's almost all crossovers. It's almost all, building up speed through crossovers, which is something I look for in prospects. To be 6'7" rather, with that level of refinement regarding his skating ability and having adapted the way that he skates to his size, I think is fantastic. Like we both said, I mean, I don't think it's well above grade average. Well above average grade rather, regarding his skating ability, but it's decent enough to get him around the ice, to get him in the right spots. And I've noticed as well that he's not a player who's constantly accelerating, constantly speeding up. He's comfortable slowing down the play. He's maybe not as effective at that lower pace with the puck, but I like the way that he kind of manipulates his pace and speed in order to hit the right pockets, right?
For sure. Like that's definitely one of the areas of his game that I think will project very nicely to the NCAA level and will
Yeah.
ease his transition to that level, being able to shift gears pretty comfortably. And even though his effectiveness at different gears isn't always consistent, being comfortable in shifting gears at all is a really, really important part of still being able to retain your style and your game when you're advancing levels in the hockey world. And the jump
Yeah.
from U18 high school hockey in Canada to playing NCAA hockey in Hockey East with Boston College is that's a jump. That's a jump and a half, and I'm very excited to see how that ends up going for him. But yeah, like to talk a little bit more of the toolkit overall. I think that the skating and physicality combine really nicely on both sides of the puck. He's a really capable, and he can really be a back-checking like pest by completely enveloping the opposing puck carrier, using his reach, using his mobility to shut down the amount of space that they have to work with, and also shepherd that play, whether it be into the boards or towards a teammate, towards a defender, to really help snuff out those rush opportunities. I like how that physicality and mobility and also decision making combine on the defensive side of things. He's not necessarily projecting the Selke level centerman here by any means, but he has defensive tools, and he knows how to actually leverage them to create defensive advantages, which is something that I'm very happy to see, and you certainly don't see in every big toolsy high school player that is a draft.
Yeah, for sure. I think the other part of that for me with Letourneau is if there are still a lot of weaknesses regarding the toolkit. Like, I don't think the hands and the shot work as well together. Like I said, I like his curl and drag shot, and he changes the angle of that shot by a wide margin. But outside of that, I don't think he's a necessarily a player who's good at setting up his shot with deeks. For example, going from backhand forehand into a shot is a bit more difficult. Kind of using his crossovers to access open ice to cut inside and then take a shot is a bit more difficult. So there's still some disconnect between the hands, the brain, and the feet. But I think that compared to other players' size, he's well ahead in terms of that, and I think he can get there with time. Uh, he's going to need a lot of time. He's going to take 3, 4 NCAA years and maybe a couple of years in the AHL before getting a true shot in a middle six on an NHL team. But I think that with time, with enough patience, he can get there. In terms of habits and decision making, I've noticed that one of his habits is really kind of staying along the periphery where he can be a bit more effective, a bit more useful. He's a player who is often when he engages in board battles after making his pass, you don't really see him drive the net off the puck as much. He's really comfortable driving the net on the puck. But off the puck, he makes a pass and kind of stays at the half wall. I want to see a bit more inside drive, a bit more push to the middle from him. That's something that's lacking. And in terms of decision making, I think that this is a player who decides really well when he's making plays on the puck. Like his playmaking, like I mentioned, goes through his decision making fairly well. Once he secures a puck along the boards, he's pretty good at finding that little 6-foot pass under an opponent's stick that really just connects the play really well in the offensive zone, right?
100%. Yeah, I fully agree. There's definitely flashes of really interesting habits in his game, but that lack of inside drive is something that I certainly notice as well. And as you mentioned, on puck, he's very comfortable lowering the shoulder. He already has an array of puck protection mechanics that I think are going to serve him really well at the next level. And he's certainly not averse of driving to the slot with the puck on his stick when he does have that speed built up. And I think it's when he's at his best offensively is when he's working with speed, is when he's able to blend all of the strengths really, really nicely together. But off puck, he can get very passive and become a bit of a puck watcher, be very content to staying to the outside, and that will not be able to stay the same if he wants to be an offensively creative and impactful power forward style player. If he ends up being more of like, as you mentioned, Brian Boyle, like bottom six, big man that you plug at the net front, I could see that happening as well with a fallback game developing with time. But that'll also depend on how his career trajectory goes at Boston College and what role he ends up playing there long term. And I do think he will be there long term, at least 3 seasons with Boston College. But if he caps off as a bottom 6 guy there and struggles to make that leap into a top 6 NCAA role, I don't really see that happening in the NHL either. But if he's able to access those different habits, maybe like find a little bit more dynamic skill in his game, combine his puck hand with his other offensive tools, then we're looking at a type of top 6 NCAA unicorn who can make the leap and be a really, really exciting NHL prospect in like 4 years' time.
I agree. But that wraps things up for a second segment. We'll talk about Dean Letourneau's upside, his projection, which team would be the best fit for him at the NHL draft, and where he ends up on draft day. We'll get into that in a sec, but just before, a quick word from our sponsors at eBay Motors.
Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophies, also what keeps guy alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and far more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what it is that you are looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, which is available to US customers only, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply.
Alrighty, so let's close things off with our final segment here where we talk about Dean Letourneau's upside, his projection, and which team would be the best fit for him at the NHL draft, as well as whether or not he's worth a first-round pick. We'll get into the upside first and foremost. There's a lot of range of possibilities with Dean Letourneau. I think that there's a chance he ends up as kind of your borderline first line, possibly more second line, kind of high-end playmaking big forward who can do a bit of everything, who can defend fairly well, who can play on your first or second penalty kill, first or second power play. The versatility with Letourneau and the different outcomes that come with it is really what makes it kind of a unique prospect in this class. Obviously, the size plays into that, but I think that regardless, there's so many different things he can do and places he can specify in order to work out. But everything would need to come together in order for him to be a top six forward. I don't think that's likely at all. We're talking 5%, 10% chance at most. Whereas the likely outcome is probably kind of a third liner who will play some key minutes for you, who will kind of be an important piece on a contender moving forward. I think kind of Nick Paul in terms of role, that kind of player. But do you see, are you a bit more optimistic about the likelihood of him reaching kind of his full potential, or what do you think regarding that?
Maybe slightly, like you were saying, 5 to 10%. I might be saying 15%. So maybe it's a little bit more optimistic. I also think that if he maxes out his potential, that he could be a unicorn type of first liner. Probably not down the middle. Probably like as a winger on a first line, and having a bit more of like a rover responsibility, whereas versatility can really be leveraged to the maximum rather than being bogged down with defensive zone responsibility and being a bit more of a like transition defense type of player who can chip in the defensive zone, but isn't there to drive defensive results. But that said, I think as you mentioned, like a Nick Paul or Nick Bukestad type of like third line role where you're bringing like a lot of versatility, but also like that size and physicality, that ability to play up the lineup in case of injuries. That within the range of likely outcomes with Letourneau if he does end up being like a day in day out valuable NHLer, but there's
Yeah.
also a chance he's not an NHLer at all, right? Like he's going to need 4 years plus to develop into an NHLer in some capacity, and the chances of that development road like falling apart in somewhere along that line is certainly elevated with this player.
Yeah.
Not a player that I think I'd personally be gutsy enough to take a swing on in the first round. There are other risks that I think I find more favorable compared to the Tourneau. But that said, if we're looking at potential team fits with this, where do you think he lands? Do you think he has a chance of like a decent chance of going on day one in that top 32 range?
I think there's a chance of it. I don't think it's likely. If you look at the teams in the bottom end of the first round that are most likely to take a swing on him, I mean, if the Arizona Coyotes had, if the Utah HC or whatever it's going to be called, has
Yeah.
has a pick, had a pick in the late first, he's gone, like for sure. He's exactly what they look for. They don't, but they do have a lot of second, third round picks. If they try to package them to move up, I think that it's definitely going to be the drafting Letourneau. Outside of that, though, in the first round, I don't see any teams that would really kind of take a hard look at him and go, "Yeah, this is our guy." But I think he doesn't get past
Montreal?
Chicago. I'd be really shocked if Montreal goes for him. I think they've understood how much they've stocked up on size recently, and it, I don't think adding another big forward will compensate for Cole Caulfield being small. Like, nothing's changing that fact. And they've already got Slavkovsky and Suzuki working really well with him. Outside of him, how many like really truly undersized forwards do they have? Not enough, I think, to go for the 6'7" guy just for the sake of going for the 6'7" guy. But I'm looking at Chicago and how much they're desperate to add size to their forward core with Frank Nazar, with Connor Bedard, with Oliver Moore, and kind of their forward core moving forward. They need a big guy, and I think that Dean Letourneau could be a great fit there. Worst case scenario, they'll have two of those three forwards I just mentioned, Nazar, Moore, and Bedard, on a first line. Have their second line be centered by the other, and have their third line be centered by Letourneau long term. But I think that they're looking to add size, so I wouldn't be shocked at all if Chicago adds them with their first pick of the second round. Like, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
And otherwise, Utah has a selection at 38th, and I doubt he falls beyond that point.
Yeah, absolutely. They're going for him. There's no doubt about it. They what was it, like every single pick of theirs in the 2023 draft was above 6'3" or something like that.
There's like two exceptions, and one was like 5'11", but it was in a sea of 6'5" plus guys. Yeah, it was an entertaining draft class for sure.
Yeah, Dean Letourneau's not getting past them. But other than that, if we're talking early second round guys, like who do you think among the kind of rebuilding teams could use a guy like Dean Letourneau, and especially would have the patience to let him develop properly?
Well, I don't know about the second part, but I know about the first part. The Ottawa Senators. They like their. Yeah, they took a 10th overall swing on Tyler Boucher, so who's to say? I was going to say
they seem to be pretty patient with him as well, right? Like they're taking their sweet time with Tyler Boucher.
I mean, he's been injured a lot. He hasn't really been healthy enough for them to not be patient. He's kind of forced their patience in the past couple seasons, but I think Ottawa would be an interesting landing spot. But again, that would necessitate him getting past 38th and Utah, which I think is obviously possible. Like at the draft, nothing is certain, but Letourneau's likely going to go in this range. And if we've learned one thing about how that organization drafts in recent years, it's that they love size and they do not mind taking swings on sides that require patience. So in terms of that patience aspect, Utah is the franchise for it.
100% for sure. Outside of that, I mean, in terms of first round value, I think we both hit the nail on the head. I think that there's too much risk involved with Letourneau. I mean, unless your scouting team is really, really good and is able to identify how to mitigate that risk and how likely he is to reach his upside properly and sees that likelihood as being high enough to take that swing. And I'm sure they've done their research into the kind of intangibles that lead to better results, that lead to maybe 5% or 10% more likelihood to reach your full potential. Off ice work rate, off ice kind of results in terms of how much work you put into your studies, all that stuff. There's a lot that goes into things that we won't necessarily have access to here that NHL scouts would have the resources in order to look up and identify. And if a team does all their research on that end and sees that this is a player who's dedicated, who's motivated, who puts in a lot, puts in an above average amount of work compared to his peers, sure, why not? But I think with the information that we have right now, there's too much risk involved. There's way too many variables that can't be accounted for that would result in Letourneau not only not being an NHLer, not only not being an effective NHLer, but not being an NHLer at all, which is a main issue, right? So, the thing is, even if he does develop properly, I think the way that it works out for Letourneau is if he develops properly, we're talking about a middle sixer at best. I'd be really shocked if he reaches that top line upside. But, again, if every single thing goes right, there is that likelihood. And having a 6'7" guy in your top six is just, it's not fair. We've seen what Tage Thompson's able to wreak in terms of havoc in the NHL. I can only imagine what a fully, properly developed Dean Letourneau can do. But that wraps things up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you think of Dean Letourneau, if he's worth the risk for your team, if you would pick him, all that good stuff. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please leave us a rate and review and make sure to make us your first first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your news and updates about what's going on around sports on YouTube's first 24/7 sports channel. And make sure to tune in for our next shows as we continue our prospect coverage for the month of June and finish up heading up to the NHL draft. We'll both be there. Hope we can see you there as well. If you're coming, let us know in the comments as well. This has been Hadi Kalakash, Director of North American Scouting for Dauber Prospects, with Sebastian Hyde, Director of European Scouting and Head Scout for Dauber Prospects, and we hope you tune in next time.